Recognized Uncle Walker D01. Recognized Skull Mutant D27.
Hello, team. Today in the Watchtower, we welcome Sofia Soderstrand. Sofia is the moderator of the One Shot Podcasts Wiki and is a huge supporter of the podcast community, including us. A few weeks ago, Sofia and I got in a discussion that, as many geeky conversations do, quickly evolved into something that I wanted to bring to the show. Sofia, thanks for coming on the show and joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that our discussion episodes draw on anything and everything related to Young Justice, including both seasons of the series so far, the comics, and the video game. If you have not seen, read, or played all the material and are spoiler wary, consider this your warning. And with all that out of the way, let's dive in. So, Sofia, I just touched on that, the one big thing in the intro, which is moderating the One Shot Podcast Wiki. But tell us a little bit more about who you are, where you are, and what you do in the world.
Yeah, well, as you said, I'm Sofia, and I my big contribution to the sort of podcasting and fandom things in general has been the One Shot Wiki that I started and moderate and still try and sort of keep sort of up to date. I live in Sweden and studied last year now becoming a programmer, hopefully.
Nice.
Yeah. Otherwise, in the past, I've sort of written a blog about being trans and my experiences, especially sort of the first year coming out.
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Right. We're going to talk about that a little bit more too, because it ties into the kind of the reason why I wanted to bring our conversation here.
Yeah.
But when did you first see Young Justice? Did you see it on DVD? Did you see it on Netflix, the original run?
Well, I did see the original run. When it came out, I got a hold of it and stayed with it until, I think that's the thing. I never really sort of decided to stop watching, but when I found out that it was canceled, I sort of lost the initial drive to sort of finish it.
Oh yeah. No, I get that.
But then actually when you sort of started talking about doing this podcast, I was like, I really got to finish that.
Yeah.
So that's when I sort of got the last, I rewatched the whole thing on Netflix.
Yeah. Fantastic. That's awesome. Because you and I had met, you and I first met when another fan and I were having this online joking war about who was the bigger campaign podcast fan. Campaign is being one of the One Shot Podcast Network's podcasts. And then as I remember it, we both suddenly realized that neither one of us were that fan. That would be you, because you had rocked out the wiki, and we were like, dude, yeah. What are we even doing? This is hilarious. Sofia totally stomps both of us.
Yeah, I remember that. That was sort of fun. It was great because it was the first time I felt like James and Kat sort of welcomed me into the sort of fandom community in such a way. And because when I started listening, I mean, I didn't have this sort of fandom relationship.
Yeah.
But then I sort of started following them on Twitter, and then I was like, so it's been like a while now, and they haven't got a wiki. I should really sort of they really need a wiki to keep track of stuff. And I'm like, well, I guess I could start a wiki. And then that sort of escalated into me sort of obsessively for like 6 months. I was like really sort of obsessively uploading lots of art, collected fan art, sort of.
Oh my God, there's so much of it too.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It was great. And but it was sort of an amazing feeling, like people who I've never talked to knew who I was and like hailed me as some sort of big fan. And I was like, whoa, that's kind of cool.
Yeah, we all did. When I remember hearing Kat talk about it on the podcast, she was like, oh my God, they started a wiki. It's so beautiful. And then I popped over there and I was like, yeah, it's crazy. Because technically I'm on it, sort of weirdly. because I was on Talking Tabletop, and then that got incorporated into the One Shot Network.
Yeah.
And I'm like, my name is on this wiki. That's weird to me, and awesome.
Yeah, but
And then since then we've been talking, and then we started Whelmed, and then you were following us there, and I was like, oh God, super fan Sophia's following us. This is fantastic. I love this. But before Young Justice, what was your history with DC and comics in general? Like, you saw the original run, so was it something you just stumbled on, or?
Well, I mean, I've always been a geek, sort of grown up in a home of geeks. I have 3 older brothers, varying degrees of sort of comic book and RPG nerds.
Nice.
So I sort of inherited like the fascination with it, but it never really took off until I was in my 20s, actually, when I sort of had my own income and like, well, I grew up watching like the animated series, Batman, the animated series, and like Superman and Spider-Man and stuff like that. But like, well, you know how it is watching TV. It's like very sporadic when you see it, if you don't like watch it rigorously. And this is especially true in Sweden, because like sometimes they don't translate everything. Sometimes we sort of get strange sort of...
That didn't even occur to me. So in the original run, was it airing in English, or did you get a translated version?
We got it translated. So I like... wasn't
so
until... So when I was in my 20s, I was like... Did you know that Mark Hamill is the Joker? And I was like, what? So that was like, so then I rewatched the whole thing in English and sort of watched the old animated DC Universe, everything sort of a couple of months there.
That's so funny. This reminds me, when I was in college, I had a friend of mine who he used to watch Star Trek when he was a kid, but it was with a German voiceover guy. And so Captain Kirk's voice was all like really deep, like this voice. And he like came to the United States and he watched it in English and he was like, what is wrong with his voice? Like, he's got this like high pitched voice. It was a totally different persona just on the translator, which I think is hilarious.
That's like one of the things every Swedish kid grows up with, is this transitioning from watching like dub and then going to sort of, I mean, technically, I mean the dub or sub, but most people in Sweden don't really like need subtitles or stuff like that. English is taught very early on, but like, so there's like most of them, one Disney movie is like, this is the one you actually first watched in English, and once you've done that, you never go and watch the Swedish ones again, because you can suddenly hear all the sort of like, especially Disney, this is true. You can suddenly hear all this like translated rhymes that doesn't really work, and they had to sort of twist the lyrics. And sort of,
oh God, the songs would be translated. Oh my gosh! Like, I'm sorry. This is like, I'm like having this eye-opening like realization.
Reading comics in Swedish is also like not... I don't know how the comic scene really looks like today, but when I grew up there, they did translate stuff, but it's expensive, and from the impression I got was like, you couldn't really expect sort of to get translated a lot of issues. It wasn't just the success of the comic, but the success of the translation of the comic that sort of dictated if it got so. So I did read some comics growing up. It was like inherited stuff and loose sort of numbers. So, for example, I was so sort of shocked when Spider-Man came out and the Green Goblin was the like bad guy, because in my book I had like one issue of Spider-Man with the Hobgoblin.
Oh, right.
And I was like, wait, there's another goblin that looks almost exactly like him, but who's actually a bigger villain than the only one I've ever read.
Oh, God.
So there's a lot of stuff like that. But then and that also changed in my 20s. Sort of when the iPad blew up, Comixology opened up, and all of a sudden you could actually start reading some like collected issues and stuff like that in a much cheaper way than imported stuff.
Right. So you had some background with it. And when you saw Young Justice was coming on, so I was drawn to it, obviously, because I was a big fan of the Titans. Obviously, I'm a big fan of Robin. Like, I was like, yeah, I'm going to watch anything that's got Robin in it for at least a little bit and see if it's a train wreck or not, right? And so that's what drew me to it. But I find that sometimes people are either drawn to the idea of sidekicks or they really don't like the idea of sidekicks. You know what I mean?
I don't actually remember how I sort of... I think it was in a period of my life where sort of, oh, it's a new thing coming out of a brand that I generally like. I'm going to watch it. I didn't...
Yeah.
And then it was really, really great. And is it sort of... I didn't really have an opinion on sort of sidekicks. I think I was a bit on the snarky side, like you shouldn't have kids in sort of superheroes doing superhero stuff. It's stupid, but then it's like
being shot at by bullets and yeah. I can see that point.
But it's that's sort of like a cynical point of view that I've sort of given up. It's like, well, you have to give the buy-in of the comic. That
right.
It's one of the things, like when people say, well, Batman actually kills more people because he doesn't kill the supervillains. It's one of those phases you go through. And it's like, well, that's not the conceit of the thing. Is that superheroes doesn't kill,
right?
And you have to sort of
some superheroes don't kill.
Yeah, well,
right.
Yeah, but that's a big part of like the conceit of the thing. It's like, no, of course it's not realistic, but it's a story about it's heroics and hope and stuff. So
yeah, exactly. And from a writing standpoint, too, the thing with Batman, this idea that because of the fact that he doesn't just outright just gun somebody down, it actually requires him to solve a problem in much more, like spend much more thought, much more planning, much more. It's harder to do. Like, and if you're a writer, sometimes you don't want to do that. Like, you don't want to put that thought into it. Like, why doesn't he just, get the most efficient way, So, yeah. I almost wish we'd invited you on to just talk about the differences in consumption of media. We may have to have you back on the podcast to talk about the differences in overseas media consumption, because I am absolutely fascinated. Because we've talked to Morgan Jenkins in Australia, and we have fans like Blake Ryan Batman in Australia too, like all these people around the United States, but they're all technically English-speaking countries that have a core of English as their language. So it's not that big of a jump, but yeah, I'm fascinated. From a storytelling standpoint.
I could talk about it for hours as well. So
okay, all right. Well, I think we're gonna do that. Look forward to that, everyone. So the conversation that I referenced earlier actually started. The one that I referenced that was bringing you on the podcast started because I had been thinking about the conversation that I'd had way back in the day now with Quinn Wilson, talking about linguistics and shape-shifting and personality versus identity, and this deep dive that we did into McGann back in the day. After that, I've been thinking about that conversation since Quinn and I had that conversation. Because shape-shifting, I don't talk about this much on the podcast, but my personal spirituality is born from shamanism. So shape-shifting is actually a particularly spiritual concept for me. And shapeshifters in media and shapeshifters in role-playing games, they mean more to me than, I'm going to turn into a dog and run through the streets to track a guy or whatever. There's a lot going on with that. So this conversation I had with Quinn was it touched me. But as I was thinking about it, and I've been thinking about it off and on, I started to realize that it may be very important to other people on a more physical plane, i.e. trans men and women. And I wondered if there was like a connection or whether there wasn't any connection. And it was just something I was thinking of. I didn't know. So since you and I had chatted several times in the past, I reached out to you and you were kind enough to answer some questions for me. And then we got in this really interesting conversation. I was like, we need to just have you on the show. It just needs to come on the show. So when I first asked you about do you have a connection with this shape-shifting concept, you did mention that you had always been fascinated by shapeshifters, yeah? Yeah,
that's true. I mean, I can't really sort of trace it back to any specific sort of date, but I've always loved shapeshifters. It's a cool power. But I remember that's not very many years ago actually, I sort of got a friend who was really into Sailor Moon, and there's another thing. We only got like 2 seasons of Sailor Moon translated, so I didn't have any clue that there were so many of them. But she showed me sort of like a later season Sailor Moon, and there was this was before I was like even knew myself I was trans, and there was this boy band that transformed into girl Sailor Scouts, and that sort of flipped my
I've never seen Sailor Moon. All of our friends talk about it all the time. I feel like I need to watch it. So
yeah, I feel like
I'm fascinated by this.
It was like I watched it a lot, but not very many episodes. It turns out, because like I watched it a lot. The things that was on TV
was available.
Pokemon, yeah, Pokemon and Sailor Moon every morning, every summer. But it was the same episodes every summer. But so I've seen a lot of the early seasons of Sailor Moon.
Right.
But this sort of idea sort of really flipped my entire worldview, because, as I said, this was before I realized I was trans, but I was like, I want to write a story about someone who realizes that their sort of superhero form is a girl, but then they sort of get more comfortable in their superhero form and they start not wanting to go back to their mundane life. And that's sort of a big part of me sort of going on my sort of journey of self-discovery and realizing I was trans, was this idea that so shape-shifting really triggered some really intense emotions in me.
Yeah.
And sort of still to this day, I mean, like shape-shifting is like a power, because that's the thing. I'm what they call sort of a binary trans woman.
Okay.
I don't really consider myself like on the like male spectrum at all.
I gotcha.
But there's still like, I've grown up with my body that I don't really hate as much as I know some trans people do. And sort of like the shape shifting is like, if I could actually sort of get the body I want and still sort of feel like I didn't have to give up my old body. It's a complicated feeling.
Yeah.
Because like you sort of feel like you're invalidating your own identity if you sort of feel happy with some of your like male traits.
Oh, but, right. I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Shape-shifting is like it's really like this power fantasy. Like,
yeah, that's something that you brought up, which I thought was interesting. We were talking, like, because I was thinking like, oh, is it an analogy? Is it analogous in any way to how, like McGann as a character? But you said, no, it's not really a trans analogy because it doesn't fit the same, but it's more of a kind of a superpower fantasy. And I was like, I break that open because that's interesting.
Right, yeah. Because you talked about, like, there's a lot in McGann's story that's sort of really speaking, like, like her, so she has a form she tried to hide and that she feels really awful about. But what makes her not an analogy is that her power is like the solution to every trans person's problem. So she can't really be a good like metaphor, because a good metaphor, like the struggles need to be sort of representative of our struggles. And she has a lot of the same, like she goes through a lot of the same troubles with sort of trying to hide her former life. And like, not every trans person goes through that, but a lot of people do that. And so there's a lot to recognize in her, but it's not a good trans metaphor. It's a trans power fantasy. That's what we want.
The ability to express yourself as you see yourself.
Yeah.
And I was thinking the same thing when we were having this conversation. I was like, man, when I was in McGann's age, what was because my residual self-image was not what I looked like. There was, what would I want to represent? What would I choose to be myself if I really wanted to do that? Like, and how would that be different than I am now? And how would that evolve and shift and change? Would I get a pixie cut? Those kinds of questions. And then this idea that periodically for our Patreon backers, we run these masks games. And one of the characters in the game, which I think is just this amazing idea, the character is a shapeshifter. And so when they're in their superhero form, they have to hide their identity, right?
Yeah.
But it never occurred to me until, our backer did this. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was. Oh, I feel so bad. But the idea was, while they're a superhero, they're one sex. While they're not a superhero, they're the other sex. It's like they don't have to wear a mask because they're literally an entirely different,
Right.
person representation. Like, I was like, oh, like when I think of like, oh, I'm a shapeshifter, I need to like hide myself. I will look like a cat person. You know what I mean? Not like, or I will change my facial features to something else. But this idea that triggered in me this thought process of like, do we even know know that McGann was born female? Like,
No.
we don't actually technically know. Like, we can make some assumptions based on some things that were said, but I mean, she could have been, and that applies to every Martian for that matter.
Yeah. I mean,
Like,
what is even sex and gender on Mars? Like,
she says that her shapeshifting is on a genetic level, meaning she can literally change the sex of who she is, right? I don't know. It cracked my head open. And I was like, I got to talk to somebody about this.
yeah. It's interesting, actually. You bring up masks, and I was talking to I was sourcing other trans people on Twitter about sort of their feelings about superheroes and trans analogies, and they were actually talking about this. Are they called playbooks? I haven't actually.
Yeah, the playbooks. Yep.
Yeah, that they felt were so strong analogy for being trans that they actually couldn't play them, and it's the transformed. Because like. It's not that, like, I'm on HRT now, so my body is slowly changing into something that's more like what I want to look like. But it's a very painful process because mostly people can still tell that you are trans. And so you sort of feel exposed, and sometimes you feel very ugly and hideous. You feel like a monster to the world. And that's sort of a big part of the transformed playbook from what I've gathered from this
goodness. Yeah.
And it was such a, like, if you want sort of a better I mean, it's still not a good metaphor because metaphors it's become complicated because the transforms are literally ugly, and if you say it's too close of a metaphor, then you're also calling sort of trans people ugly.
Yeah, right. I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
But it was it was really enlightening to read that, sort of getting that perspective on.
Yeah, the transformed character is kind of like the idea is supposed to be like the Ben Grimm Thing version in Fantastic Four, where he was like this guy, and he gets turned into something that he can't change out of, can't control, and literally stands out, in a crowd. However that is, you stand out in a crowd somehow, right? And it's not. I don't think it's necessarily. I mean, I don't read the transformed as necessarily that you're ugly. It's just that you can't pass yourself off in a crowd, right? You know what I mean?
Exactly, and that's sort of really. That's a lot. Sort of, if you want to go for like metaphors or analogies, that's a lot closer to sort of the trans experience, because that's sort of the thing about when we use superpowers as metaphors. It's not the fun that brings the analogy home. It's the problems that comes with them, and like the problems that comes with shapeshifting is not. I mean, I'm sure there's been lots of exploration of that, but it's the thing with like the transformed, the sort of big. I mean, a lot of people see it as sort of a choice coming out, and in some ways it is, but it doesn't personally feel like a choice. It feels like you've been thrown out for the world to look at like this. So yeah, I want to mention it's an article by Nora Blake, and she's co-host of the Hollow Sweetheart Star Trek Discovery podcast.
Okay,
it's really great.
If you have links, anything you have links to that you want to share out, there's a couple other things that you had mentioned in our conversation we're going to talk about and link out to as well.
Yeah.
So aside from that specific aspect of shapeshifting and how it related to you personally, and this idea of this, I'm just loving this boy band shape, like I just love it. Aside from that aspect of it, are there other aspects to just shapeshifting as a concept or idea, or is it I guess, is it always related to this this idea of self-identity, this idea of discovery for yourself, or is it other things about shapeshifting that connect with you and identity?
I mean, I get it's sort of like this dream of freedom, I guess, because shapeshifting means like you can literally sort of step out of your skin and into someone else's skin for a while,
right?
And that's great. And I actually sort of tangenty. I really like Terry Pratchett. He writes about sort of some shapeshifters like werewolves and stuff, and he talks and sometimes just magical transformations. And he talks that like form sort of always brings function. So you can't shapeshift and stay exactly the one you were. You will always sort of take on aspects that you didn't know were sort of inherent to that shape. And
yes.
I really like that concept.
Yeah. Is this his Discworld stuff?
Yeah, it's Discworld stuff.
Guys, if you haven't read Terry Pratchett's Discworld, you need to, I don't know, God, there's at least 24 books in those series, but I think there's 40. Incredible. Oh, there's 40? Okay, so there were 24 back when I was in college, 20 years ago. Unfortunately, we've lost Terry Pratchett now, I'm sad to say, but his books are incredible. I
mean, his books are still, I mean, I try and sort of I've really sort of trying to diversify what I read nowadays, but I still always sort of come back to, I have the audiobooks and sort of listen, and there's always like new stuff I find in his writing. And I mean, I don't want to say sort of he wrote about trans stuff, because he didn't, but he wrote a lot of things that were hit really close to home and didn't feel like a clumsy analogy, sort of. Right. Because he wrote about like dwarf society with bearded dwarfs, and then dwarfs who wanted to sort of act feminine, and the sort of patriarchy of the sort of, a lot of things that you still identify without it being too close. Yeah. Sort of, it didn't seem like a metaphor. It felt like something that you could draw parallels to.
And I think this is, from a storytelling standpoint, I think that's a really interesting point. I agree with you. I think what Terry Pratchett did is he spent a lot of time digging down and uncovering fundamental human pieces, like fundamental human psychology that everyone and anyone can basically relate to in some way, and then put it on a page in a fantasy world that kind of tweaked it, made it humorous, made it deep, did all these things to make us feel like any good fantasy, right? Like the X-Men, right? In the particularly in the 80s, right? The 70s and the 80s, it was all about racism. But you had this mutant like parallel to racism in a group of people who were all from different races and countries around the world, right? Like so you get to the end of the story and you're touched and you're moved and you feel for them and all this kind of stuff, and also your thought process about the real world has shifted and changed, and you've been able to look at something from a different perspective. And I think that's one of the things that Terry Pratchett and really, really good authors do. It's not about like his whole, I mean, the character of Death is just like mind blowing. Like Mort, who's Death's apprentice, and this Death character is just rocks my world. One of my favorites is called Little Gods. And it's this whole concept about like, what is theology and what is faith and belief and like all these things. But it's not. It is, but it's not, right? It's like you're reading the story about this guy who is carrying around his all-powerful God in his pocket because he's been changed into like a turtle and has no power, and he's not the sharpest tool in the shed either. And so you're just watching this guy going through this book, and you're laughing and you're feeling for him and all this kind of stuff. But then you get to the end of the book and you realize all of this stuff that's there. It's like he's showing you these things, but he doesn't have to do it with a hammer. He didn't start the book saying like, I want to make a analog of this, you know?
No, I mean, I think that's the sort of the great thing and the sort of tragic thing about Pratchett books is that he wrote comedy so well that people forgot that it was like not tragedy. Just sort of, it wasn't just sort of comedy satire. It was angry satire. It was tragedy. He wrote very political stuff, and he wrote it very obviously, but people are like, oh, that funny Pratchett guy writing about a flat earth. But I think that's sort of one of he always sort of had a nugget of like this real human truth in him, and I think that's also like what you mentioned, the X-Men. It's like one of those things that's been, even if it's wasn't a conscious choice of the people creating the X-Men, like, but it's sort of been a through line throughout, and they've been the metaphor for race, and now they're sort of both a metaphor for race and queer people. And like I've talked to some people now, and like a lot of them mentioned like the X-Men were the one you identified with because they were sort of they were the ones who were treated like villains for things that they had no control over. That wasn't their fault. I mean, there's always this sort of, there's been like a backlash of late of people sort of resisting using the X-Men as an analogy for queer and racial stuff, and I understand it. It's important we don't conflate like mutants for a particular minority group.
Yeah.
Because like, I mean, then we get into things like, well, of course, I mean, the sort of Mutant Registration Act, that's a big deal in the movies. Like, it's still like we've had things like that for queer people and for black people, and but it's not a good analogy because the X-Men have powers that actually make them dangerous. I mean, you can still debate if it's right or wrong, but
right.
But if you draw the analogy too close, you're saying like, well, you're saying things you don't want to say. But I
right.
still think they have inherent power because as a metaphor. But the thing you have to do, I think, when doing things like that, it actually sort of, the X-Men is kind of good at this, actually making them racially diverse, actually making a lot of them queer. So the metaphor is on 2 levels.
Yeah.
Or 3 levels. Like, it's a metaphor that need to go deeper than just the surface level.
Yeah. And for me, you know, coming from, you know, being a straight white male grew up in the South, I related to the X-Men too in these different ways. Kurt Wagner, Nightcrawler, is one of my favorite characters next to Dick Grayson in all of comics. And part of that reason was because when I was picked on a lot for being a very scrawny, 125-pound, non-athletic, geeky, like emotional kid. And to look at Kurt and see him being this, like, he wasn't super strong, he wasn't Colossus, he wasn't even Wolverine, he was acrobatic, he was lithe, and what he looked like stood out, and he couldn't do anything about that. Yet he kept this kind, gentle, giving, protective heart, even though he had these other things going on. So I think that one of those things is that instead of drawing that specific, like, heavy-handed metaphor to a particular group or race or you know, that kind of thing, it's just that the X-Men are telling their story in a way that everyone can relate to someone in the story, right? We all like Wolverine. I don't know how many people relate to Wolverine necessarily, but there are people I'm sure that relate to Peter, to Colossus, right? Who grew up in a farm in another country and is in a foreign land, and, like, you know, all these kinds of things. Like, there are things that you can hopefully relate to. And we're talking a lot about the X-Men on a show about Young Justice, but the you know, the parallels are there, and how they do it in Young Justice as well, showing this hopefully diversity, in particularly of family dynamics, right? Family organization and dynamics. But then to be able to, like, do what we're doing, which is kind of granularly dive into a single character in an ensemble cast and see that McGann represents things to a lot of people. She represents something to me, and I'm, you know, in a different way than she represents to some other people, and to Emily, for that matter, my, you know, co-host. She relates to her for a completely different reason than I do. I relate to the shapeshifting on this deep, fundamental, soul-changing level. She relates to her on this idea that she can be feminine and crazy powerful, right? And then you can see a different aspect of her, right? All in the same character. Yeah,
I mean, I relate to her a lot. And, like, other things I relate to, sort of this, you've talked about it a lot on Whelmed. Her sort of sort of almost crafting her personality on Earth to be someone like that's a common thing for trans people. Like, sort of, okay, I don't know who I am now that I'm out, but I know sort of who, sort of, I have a role model. I'm going to craft myself in her image and become her. And then sort of like a few years later, we get the pixie cuts because we're sort of fun. It's a thing. The pixie cuts after a few years of sort of being out as a trans woman, because like the hair, I've read this a lot, that a lot of trans people have like a real strong connection to our own hair, because that's like the one thing that I felt I could sort of express when I was a kid. Like, yeah, I can have long hair. And I didn't really understand why it was super important to me to always have long hair, even though I was bullied for it. Like, people questioned my gender when I was a kid, and like I didn't understand why it was so important to me until now. It's obvious, and now that I've been sort of out a couple of years and finally on HRT, I'm like, yeah, I like my hair, but I want to maybe do some fun stuff with it, do some haircuts, like, because you don't feel that freedom at the beginning, because you sort of want to create a sort of, no, I am a normal woman. I want to look like a normal woman. You go sort of over a bit like over the top on femme. So I definitely identify with Megan.
Yeah.
Even if like her power is, as we said, it's a fantasy. It's not analogous to being trans. It's
right. I think this parallels to Superboy in an interesting way, for me anyway. It's that same identity. He felt like, okay, I don't know who I am. I guess I'm a hero or I'm a weapon. Those are the two choices people have given to me. I guess I'm a hero or a weapon. I guess that's a thing. I'm going to try and figure out which one I am. And it isn't until, of course, we get into this, we get into the second season after the 5-year jump, where he's realized that no, I can be both and neither, and a whole bunch of other things too, and it's all okay. I think we all, like a lot of us, can relate to going through that. Like, you don't know. Yeah. I read somewhere, I wish I remember where, but this idea that we see other people's highlight reel of their life. We don't see the uncut version that we see of our own, right? So we can grow up and think like, oh, okay, well, that person is so amazing. I want to be like that person. I will model myself after that person, which can be great. It's good to have these role models to like try and aspire to. But then eventually we get through teenage years, maybe your 20s, maybe into your 40s, says Rich to himself, before you kind of realize like who you are and allowing yourself to express who you are, however that happens to be, going through those changes. I think a lot of people can relate to that and relate to that in other human beings, like understanding that everyone goes, I'm assuming everyone goes through that to some extent.
I mean, I think that's a lot of trans experience, I think, are relatable to other people. Maybe not in the way they think that they're relatable, but like there's it's one of the great things I think about sort of using superheroes, and especially teen superheroes, because we see ourselves in their situations, even though they're exaggerated. Like, people sometimes, I've heard people say like, you can't like identify with that person like superhero. Their problems are life or death. Your problems aren't life or death. But when you're a teenager, every problem feels like life
and death.
So,
yeah, exactly.
Like, sometimes sort of when you watch a sort of deep emotional movie that goes into sort of one specific event that isn't life or death, but you can really connect to that feeling, that's great. But I'm 30. I still more connect with when someone's problem literally escalates to a life or death situation. That's how I relate to things, and that's why I think that's one of the things I really love about Young Justice. Their problems sort of are a projection of teenage problems and queer problems, and they are sort of projected through this lens of actually everything is as bad as you think it is. But here's a way to deal with it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This idea that we're watching these episodes and them literally fighting like Mammoth or someone else is a life or death situation, but it is handled in the same, like, also in that episode, Superboy is dealing with who is my real dad, and Lex Luthor is my dad, and he seems to care about me and talks to me, while my other dad I actually like or should like is ignoring me. That is as important and life or death to Superboy as it is, oh, I'm gonna fight Killer Frost now. You know what I mean? That life or death analogy, that life or death feeling, it's similar, the same.
Definitely.
Yeah. So there were a few things when we were talking too. You had mentioned about some. I don't know if these are comics. These are novels that you had talked about. Novels.
Yeah.
Dreadnought and Sovereign, which is the sequel.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's these young adult superhero novels in a world. It's a really cool, fleshed out world where superheroes existed for about 100 years, and it sort of shaped the world. And the main character is a young trans woman that accidentally inherits the mantle of Dreadnought, like the most powerful superhero, like very much a Superman analogy, but a bit, well, not exactly, but Superman basically. And the thing that sort of is a large part of the catalyst for the book is that part of her transformation into Dreadnought is her transforming into an idealized version of herself. So like for the previous Dreadnought, it was like, oh, they grew an inch and sort of lost a toe in the war, but that grew back because that's their ideal version of themselves. But when a trans woman gets the power to become an idealized version of themselves, they actually get like their body. I don't want to say it's like they get the body of a woman, because of course every trans woman is a woman, but like they get matching body.
No, I hear what you're saying. For some reason, while we were talking about this, there was a memory. So you said you watched Batman the Animated Series, right?
Yes.
Do you remember? Did you watch Batman Beyond as well?
Oh yeah.
So there's an episode we've talked about a couple times on the show. I think Pranks Paul and I talked about it. Called it's one where it's called Epilogue, and it's where they kind of tie in the Batman Beyond universe with the Justice League and Batman animated universe.
Oh yeah, I remember that one.
Where Terry's older and like Batman sits with Ace as she dies, and it's like, oh, it's just heartrending. But if I remember correctly, there have been multiple versions of the Royal Flush Gang in the DC animated universe series of shows. But in that one, if I remember correctly, they capture all of the other Royal Flush Gang except for Ace, and then they all get kind of transformed back into their like human forms or whatever. And Queen, who is a woman in the fight, gets transformed back into a guy at the end. If you haven't seen that, I saw that and I was like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then I just didn't even think about it very much, and then just went on with because then you see Batman sitting with Ace and you're crying and you just have to curl up in a ball for a while and turn the TV off. But like each time I see that, it always catches me. But it's fairly quick in the scene. But it makes me wonder, like, I mean, this is clearly something that is thought about by writers, thought about by animators, right? Thought about in like, who's the author for Dreadnought?
April Daniels.
April Daniels. We're going to put links to that in the show notes too. I mean, this is definitely something that has occurred to people in the past, like to be represented. That must have been, I hate to say this, 20 years ago. It must have been in early 2000s. Or,
probably something like that.
Yeah. So, so this idea of this, like the fact that the Dreadnought turns into their kind of, what I think of like in the Matrix, they called your residual self-image, like what you think of in your mind is not, your voice isn't what you think it is when you record it and hear it back to you. And when you look in a mirror, you're like, oh God, that's not how I picture myself in my head. Right. And that leads into some, body dysmorphic, challenges when it's taken to an extreme. I've gone through some of that myself, some stuff I've worked through just recently, and I know some other friends of mine who do the same thing, particularly as we get older, and we were very different now than we were when we were a thin 18-year-old.
I can relate to that.
So how that gets reflected, do you have other, like this Dreadnought and Sovereign sounds really interesting to me, particularly the fact that you say that it's such a good fleshed out superhero world. But are there other examples of things that can help? I also think of the fact that role-playing games like Pathfinder are now bringing in, they have some of their iconic characters. Their iconic shaman class character is actually a trans dwarf.
Oh yeah.
Woman. So that's just becoming a little bit more common in role-playing games and things as well. Can you think of other examples about how things are hopefully changing and there's more representation?
I mean, I feel like I know there's a lot of stuff being written by sort of queer people now that's getting traction. I'm just on my way sort of discovering most of that myself. So I can't think of anything off the top of my head, actually.
I'm really fascinated by Dreadnought, actually. I love this concept of this idea of a person. Well, it's almost like we were talking about with Captain Marvel, where Billy Batson literally transforms into this idealized version of his adult self, almost, depending on the interpretation as well. Oh, it's so interesting.
That concept is so, because, it's one of those things that I think when Stan Lee and Kirby and all of those back when they sort of invented comic concepts, they didn't really think about the implications of what they were writing. But queer kids all over sort of like, wait, they transform into their ideal self and their ideal self is just blonde? That's not very imaginative. Like, sort of, I think there's a lot of stuff like that where, like, superhero comics are seeded with ideas that were just meant to be power fantasies for like white men that they didn't realize were like became super important to like people of color and queer people later on. Like I can't think of any example right now, but I know like
Well, so this will be a few weeks before I think this airs. If you find some things that you want to share out, let us know. We'll put some more links in the show notes, and then of course you're online. We'll get to that in a bit, and people can chat with you about more if they have questions and things like that. And you said you used to have a blog where you wrote about your experiences and things like that. Great. So we'll definitely put links to that in the show. We're gonna have a lot of links in these show notes today, everybody. So is there anything else that you wanted to add or talk about or dive into today? We talked about a lot when we were on Twitter, and so I want to make sure I caught everything.
I think that's like most of it. I've been sort of, as I said, I've been talking to a lot of trans queer people on Twitter to see what they have to say, and like the thing that I took away from it was mostly like, well, the X-Men means a whole lot to a lot of people just because they are the epitome of like people with cool powers that are still treated like scum, basically. But yeah, one of the things like for my blog that I've never completed it. It's like basically what we've been talking about this whole time. This idea about allegory, or not allegories, but applicability. There's this famous Tolkien quote. I think it's one of the forewords to one of the editions of Lord of the Rings, and he speaks like he talks about his dislike of allegory, like writing something as a stand-in for something else, and then he sort of replaces. He likes applicability, where the reader puts in what they can identify with, and
how they interpret.
That's and I think that's super important. But I also think he left out some personal responsibility from that. I think because I think one of the things that's super important when like talking about superheroes as metaphor for queer stuff is that it's actually being written by a diverse group of people. Because no, it's not supposed to be a perfect metaphor, because there's no such thing as perfect metaphors. But we want stories that are inclusive because that's important to us. And for them to actually work, they sort of, I mean, I'm not saying that straight people shouldn't write about queer people, but I'm saying that we get better results when people write from diverse angles. And I think that's one of the things that I really loved about the Dreadnought, is this perspective on a superhero that's like, her powers are not as important as sort of the gift that was given to her. Like, yeah, sure, she want to be a superhero. That's super important. But like every kid wants to be a superhero when given a chance. But what's important to her is that she has been like given this ultimate blessing of a new body. And that's like that's a perspective you don't really get in a lot of superhero writing, I think.
I think I agree with you, and I think this plays into, again, when we talk about your writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can, if you're going to have the story be about the powers, have the powers mean something and have a representation of something. Like we dove deep into this with Captain Marvel episode, right? But also, it's not always about the powers. Like some really good stories aren't really about the powers are just dressing. It's like if your movie's about your special effects, it's probably going to be a bad movie. Like if your movie's going to be about a story and the special effects are the dressing or enhance the things or feed into the story you're telling, then you're going to nail it, right?
Right.
It was the whole, at least the original idea around the first Star Wars movie, right? We saw all of this crazy world, but it was going by in what we thought was a heartbeat at the time. Like spent all this time building this Millennium Falcon and it roars across the screen. Like, you can sense there's more depth to what's going on there, but the story isn't about a 10-minute pan across the Millennium Falcon to show you the cool model they built, right?
No.
It's about the people and what's going on in it, right?
Right. Yeah, that's totally true. And I think there's a lot of untapped potential in superhero powers. So sort of like what they can do for you personally. Like they touch on this, I think, in that with Megan's telepathy, that this sort of becomes another way for the gang to the gang to communicate. That's sort of like, but it isn't just a power they use to fight battles. It's a power they use to sort of have arguments or solve arguments or freeze people out or show inclusion.
Right. Yeah. Show inclusion. Yeah, exactly. That's what Quinn was saying too, about this idea of Zatanna and her, like, she's not part of the in crowd yet, right? She doesn't get to be in on the psychic conversation yet until she becomes accepted in that place. And it becomes representative of something without being a heavy hand. Right. Like everybody gets that. You're the new kid in the group and you're the new person there and you don't know anybody and everybody's having an inside jokes about stuff you don't understand. It's pretty similar to what was happening to Zatanna in that moment, right? We all get that. Right.
And the power works as a sort of extension of that. It's like, here's a sort of a new manifestation of a familiar feeling, the feeling of exclusion, but shown through like people using telepathy and not letting you in on the line.
Yeah. Okay, man. All right. Well, there's a lot more to dive into, I am sure. So we'll wrap this up for right now, but we're going to definitely have you back on to talk about, we're definitely having you back on to talk about consumption of media overseas in non-English speaking countries.
I'm going to go and find some. I think I still have the old Swedish Batman and Spider-Man translations. Like I just got to sort of the old Swedish name for Batman used to be like, I think it's like a nickname for a bat, but it translates directly into leather patch. So they used to have like the Batman font written in the leather patch.
That's so funny. Okay, well, we'll save it for the next podcast. That sounds awesome. All right. Thanks so much for spending some time with us in the Watchtower, Sofia. Where can people find you out here on Earth Prime?
They can find me on Twitter at skullmutants. And if you want to read my old blog, that's meinthemeantime.tumblr.com. And yeah, I think Twitter is probably the best way to get a hold of me if you want to talk. I'm always happy to talk about, well, basically anything nerdy or trans stuff or Star Wars.
Or Star Wars, which she just saw and is not telling me about because she's being very polite because I see it tomorrow.
it's very hard.
I know, I'm sure it is. All right, we'll chat tomorrow then, probably after I see it, or Friday. All right, thanks to everyone else for sharing some time with us as well. You can find us on Twitter at the YJ Files, on Facebook at Crashing the Mode, on Tumblr at theyjfiles.tumblr.com, at our website, crashingthemode.com, and you can email us at whelmedpodcast@gmail.com. If you enjoyed our show, please consider sharing it with a friend. You can also support the show by giving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcatcher of choice. The ratings really do help others find the show. If you leave us a review, please let us know, especially if you're outside the U.S. We have to look a little harder to find those. And even though Season 3 has been officially announced, please continue to spread the word to friends and family about the series. #BuyYJComics on Comixology to hopefully get us more stories even sooner and get yourself up to speed for the Season 3 premiere. And as always,
stay whelmed, everyone.
You've been listening to Whelmed, the Young Justice Files podcast. Our hosts are Rich Howard and Emily Booza. Our editor and producer is Neil Powell. Our theme was composed by Emily Mio. Our logo was created by Kevin Bates. Whelmed is a fan-made podcast and is not officially affiliated with DC Comics, DC Entertainment, Warner Brothers Animation, and any other owners of Young Justice or its related source material. As such, these companies have sole ownership of all symbols, images, names, logos, and proprietary material related to Young Justice. Original content of this podcast is ours under Creative Commons. Thanks for listening, and stay whelmed.